I know exactly what you mean.
I bought a motorcycle when I was 15. I still got it.
Do you?
Yep.
Well,
Oh yeah. We both ride quite a
One of the
bit.
bikes in there is it's been with us over 40 years.
Over 40 years.
Really?
For years, millions of American Pickers fans were told a simple, perfect story. Frank Fritz left the show because of back surgery. He and Mike Wolfe drifted apart. Things just did not work out. It was sad, but simple. Except none of it was simple. 1 year after Frank Fritz died at 60 years old in a nursing home in Iowa, the full story has finally come out, and it involves more than battles with addiction and health challenges. What are the details that are finally out for the world to see? Join us as we reveal all the shocking details that were hidden for years. The show nobody told the audience the real story about. Frank Fritz appeared on 308 episodes of American Pickers between 2010 and 2021. And for most of that run, he was one of the most genuinely likable presences on American reality television. The bearded guy who got excited about old motorcycles and vintage toys, who haggled with sellers with a smile on his face and treated every barn like a treasure map, was not performing for the camera. That was actually who he was. People who knew him off-screen described the same Frank Fritz that viewers saw on screen. Someone who made everyone around him feel comfortable, who lit up when he found something interesting, and who genuinely loved the world of picking the way only someone who had been doing it his whole life could love it. Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe were not simply television partners who had been paired together by a production company. They were childhood friends from Iowa who had known each other since they were teenagers, had grown up in the same world of antique hunting and roadside treasure, and had spent years pitching the American Pickers concept to networks together before History Channel finally said yes in 2009. Wolfe described Fritz as someone who never doubted the show would happen, just like he never doubted it. Both of them completely focused on what they wanted to do and what they had dreamed of doing together. That context matters enormously when trying to understand everything that came after, because a 40-year friendship ending in silence and public feuding and a firing that nobody would explain honestly does not happen without something significant going very wrong underneath the surface. The official story about Frank Fritz's departure from American Pickers was always incomplete, and the audience that had watched him for a decade deserved better than what they were given. The real story is more complicated, more painful, and in the end more human than anything the network's press releases managed to capture. But if the official story about why Frank left was never the whole truth, what was actually happening behind the scenes that Mike Wolfe spent years covering up to protect his friend? The addiction nobody talked about. Frank Fritz's health problems did not begin with back surgery. They began considerably earlier with a diagnosis that he kept private for years before finally going public with it in 2013. Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel condition that causes severe digestive pain, extreme fatigue, and significant weight loss, had been part of Fritz's daily life since the 1990s. The medications required to manage Crohn's weakened his bones over time, setting the stage for what came next in ways that no one fully understood until the consequences were already in motion. In 2020, while handling heavy items at his Iowa home, Fritz suffered a severe back injury. The spine that years of Crohn's medication had weakened was now in serious structural trouble. The surgery that followed left him with 185 stitches and 2 metal rods in his spine, and the recovery process brought with it a prescription for painkillers that opened a door Frank Fritz found himself unable to close. The opioid addiction that developed during the recovery was not a character flaw or a moral failure. It was the predictable consequence of serious pain medication given to a man whose body had already been compromised by a decade of chronic illness management. That does not make it less devastating. It makes it more understandable than the silence surrounding it ever allowed anyone to acknowledge at the time. Mike Wolfe confirmed in a People magazine interview after Fritz's death that the real reason Frank never returned to American Pickers was his inability to pass the negative drug tests the show required. The History Channel and the production company had known. Mike Wolfe had known. And for years, while fans were watching interviews in which Frank talked about coming back to the show and blamed the departure on Mike's ego or on the network's indifference, Wolfe stayed quiet about the real reason. He said publicly that he did not have the right to tell Frank's story, that only Frank could do that, but that he did have the right to talk about how hard it had been for everyone around Frank to navigate what was happening in his life. That restraint was not cowardice. It was loyalty, the same loyalty that had kept them connected through 40 years of friendship that included the television chapter, but was never defined by it. Fritz himself checked into the Abbey Center, a treatment facility in Bettendorf, Iowa, for 77 days to address the alcohol addiction that had developed alongside the opioid dependency. He came out of treatment in 2021, told The Sun he was 11 months sober, and described his time in rehab with genuine warmth, saying they had given him a lot of information and that his days had been scheduled from morning to night. He also said he was ready to come back to American Pickers. He said the show's runner had called him on his birthday in October and told him he would call back tomorrow. That call never came. The show replaced him with Mike Wolfe's brother Robbie, and Frank Fritz found out the way everyone else did, from a public announcement. He was not gentle about his feelings on the matter. He called Wolfe's statement about missing him and praying for him something that someone else had written for Wolfe, adding that in 10 years, Wolfe had not said 5 nice things to him unless they were both laughing at someone else. Those words, delivered to a reporter while he was still in the early months of sobriety, after a 77-day treatment stay, paint a picture of a man who was hurt, isolated, and not yet in the stable emotional place that sustained recovery requires. The anger was real. So was the pain underneath it. And if the addiction and the firing were the hidden story behind the public feud, what happened next was the thing that ended any possibility of a comeback before it could even begin. The stroke that changed everything. On July 14, 2022, a friend arrived at Frank Fritz's home in LeClaire, Iowa, and found him sprawled on the floor, unable to speak. The 911 call placed from the house described a man who could not communicate and may have been having a seizure. Fritz had suffered a devastating stroke. He spent a month in the hospital before being transferred to a nursing facility, and the court documents filed by his friend Chris Davis in August 2022 described the situation with legal clarity that was also deeply human in its implications. Fritz's decision-making capacity was so impaired that he was unable to care for his own safety or provide for necessities such as food, shelter, clothing, or medical care. And he could not make, communicate, or carry out important decisions concerning his own financial affairs. The man who had spent 12 years making snap decisions about antiques in cluttered barns across America could no longer decide what he needed to eat or how to manage his own money. An emergency conservatorship was granted, with Chris Davis named as guardian and Midwest One Bank appointed to manage Fritz's financial affairs. The bank took control of the cash assets and credit accounts, demanded the ability to transfer funds to cover what were described as long-term skilled nursing care costs, and took over oversight of the Frank Fritz Finds antique store in Iowa that had been his business identity outside the television show. A wheelchair ramp was installed at his Iowa home. The conservatorship agreed to help replenish the store's inventory. The specifics of the arrangement were documented in court papers that painted the picture of a man whose entire independent life had been placed in other people's hands through no fault of his own. Mike Wolfe announced the stroke on his Instagram account, telling the world that his friend was in the hospital receiving care. What happened next was one of the smaller but genuinely painful details in this story. A friend close to Fritz indicated at the time that Fritz was not happy about Wolfe making the hospitalization public. The feud had not fully healed yet. Even at that moment, even with Frank Fritz in a nursing facility unable to speak properly, the distance between the two men had not been completely closed. Wolfe told Fox News Digital in 2025 that he would go see Fritz at the nursing home all the time, that they would talk, that they loved each other and had always loved each other. He described a reconciliation that happened gradually across the years of visits. Two old friends navigating the weight of everything that had happened between them in the rooms of a nursing home in Iowa, far from the white cargo van and the dusty barns and the television cameras that had once defined what they were to each other. Fritz's longtime friend, Annette Oberlander, described him to the Associated Press as a fierce friend who had left behind an incredible number of close friendships, because that was what mattered most to him. The loneliness of the nursing home years was at least interrupted by the people who kept showing up to be present with him. The discussions about a possible return to American Pickers, which sources say did take place in some form during 2023, never went anywhere. The body and the brain that had survived the stroke were not capable of what the show would have required. And the physical recovery, though described by those around him as slow but steady, never reached the point where a return to production was realistic. There were people who visited, people who called, people who kept him as connected to the world he had loved as the constraints of his condition allowed. And then, on September 30th, 2024, in a hospice facility in Davenport, Iowa, Frank Fritz died. He was 60 years old. Mike Wolfe was holding his hand. And if the final years told a story of friendship surviving everything that had tried to break it, what happened to the $6 million estate Fritz left behind has become a story of its own that is still not finished. The will, the father, and the court battle that is still going on. Frank Fritz was worth approximately $6 million at the time of his death. The estate included his collection of vintage motorcycles and antiques, the Frank Fritz Fine Store, and the assets that had accumulated across 12 years of television work and a lifetime of collecting. For a man who had spent his final 2 years in a nursing home under a conservatorship that controlled his financial decisions, the question of what he wanted done with that estate after his death became one that multiple parties now have very different answers to. Fritz's lawyer had filed a will to be kept safe in October 2023, and a certificate approving that will was issued on October 18, 2024, just weeks after Fritz's death. The will had been prepared and legally filed while Fritz was living under a conservatorship that had documented his impaired decision-making capacity. That timing is the center of the legal dispute that followed. On December 30th, 2024, an attorney representing an unnamed friend of Fritz's entered the probate case on that friend's behalf. On February 3rd, 2025, a separate attorney filed a petition in probate requesting that the will be set aside and invalidated, along with a demand for a jury trial to determine how the estate should be handled. The argument at the core of the challenge was that Fritz lacked the legal mental capacity to create a valid will while under a conservatorship that had been established specifically because his capacity was impaired. Fritz's own father, Bill Fritz, filed suit alleging that the will had been forged and that Frank did not have the legal capacity to sign it while under conservatorship. The caretakers and friends who had been managing his affairs countered that Fritz had been coherent when the will was made, and that the documents reflected his genuine wishes. As of August 2025, no jury trial outcome has been confirmed. The estate of a man who spent his final years in a nursing home without the ability to manage his own affairs is now being argued over in Iowa courts by the people who claim to know what he would have wanted. The conservatorship itself faced scrutiny throughout 2023 and 2024, with a judge reviewing the annual reports filed by Chris Davis and Midwest One Bank twice in 2023 for what were described as delays. Their roles were upheld in April 2024, but the renewed scrutiny in the 2025 estate disputes suggests that questions about how Fritz's affairs were managed during the final years of his life have not been fully resolved. The man who could not speak for himself during those years cannot speak for himself now either, and the courts will have to determine what justice looks like in the absence of a clear and uncontested statement of his intentions. The $6 million estate that Frank Fritz accumulated through a lifetime of loving old things and a decade of sharing that love with millions of television viewers is now a legal battleground. That is not the ending anyone who watched him light up in a barn full of forgotten motorcycles would have written for him. But it is the reality of what the final chapter of his story looks like. And ignoring it would mean telling the comfortable version of the truth rather than the whole one. And if the legal battle over the estate is the uncomfortable present tense reality, what has Mike Wolfe said about the friendship that defined the show and the loss of the man at the center of it? The revelation and its impact. Mike Wolfe has been talking about Frank Fritz more honestly in the years since his death than he was able to talk about him during the years when Fritz was still alive. And the full story was too private and too painful to share publicly. The interviews he has given in 2024 and 2025 contain the most complete picture available of what the friendship actually was, what went wrong, and what was salvaged in the end. Wolfe told Fox News Digital, "Unfortunately, he ended up toward the end of his life in a nursing home for a few years. I would go see him all the time, and we would talk. We loved each other. We've always loved each other." He said there would be no American Pickers without Frank Fritz, that Frank had been there side by side with him when he was pitching the show for 5 years, that Frank never doubted it would happen. He described being blessed to have been by Fritz's side when he took his last journey home, which was Wolfe's way of saying he was in the room when the breathing stopped. The honesty about the addiction came with an honesty about his own limitations in the face of it. Wolfe said he had tried to help Fritz as best he could. He described both of them dealing with relationships that were falling apart during the pandemic, both of them navigating personal difficulties at the same time that Frank's physical health was collapsing. He protected Fritz's privacy about the addiction for years because he believed that was the right thing to do for a friend. Whether covering up the reason for the firing was also the right thing for the audience that deserved an honest explanation is a more complicated question that Wolfe has not fully answered, and probably cannot. The truth that comes out 1 year after Frank Fritz's death is not a single revelation. It is a collection of pieces that together make a more honest portrait than the public ever received while he was alive. A man who was genuinely good at something he genuinely loved. A man whose body was compromised first by disease, and then by surgery, and then by the medication that surgery required, and then by the addiction that medication produced. A man whose friendship with his co-star survived a feud, a firing, a public silence, and 2 years of nursing home visits that nobody was filming. A man whose estate is still being argued over in Iowa, while the show he helped build continues on without him in its 27th season. American Pickers is still on the air. Frank Fritz is not in it. 1 year later, the full story of why those two things are true is finally being told. It took this long because the people involved needed the distance, and because the truth was considerably more complicated than a back surgery story was ever going to be able to hold. Do you think American Pickers handled Frank Fritz's departure honestly with the audience that had watched him for 12 years? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.